Thank you for joining us today for 10 Minutes with the Artist, a discussion about the art practice and the personal vision that guides artists. On today's episode, we're very proud to have Beau Norby, who is completing a thesis in architecture at North Dakota State University. We invited him here today to speak about his research and the creation of artifacts in preparation for his defense. The architecture of memory examines the AIDS pandemic of the 1980s in San Francisco through narrative, characters, and the very sites of suffering. Through remnants, impressions, and memories, Beau's work reminds us that what has been lurks somewhere permanently in our collective memory and the character of our place. I'm Anthony Ferris. This is 10 Minutes. Beau, thank you very much for joining us on 10 Minutes with the Artist. So in your paper, you talk about how you are looking through the lens of memory, but this is in the past. So you're interpreting this through the construct of culture and maybe records. So I was wondering how we can understand memory through a place and a time that has sort of passed beyond us.
Yeah, that's a good question. My interpretation of that is the reason I'm doing this project anyways is because I feel the topic and the victims, the people in the pandemic, don't have proper recognition in today's society. And I think it's a valuable thing that's not talked about enough. So the point of this was I wanted to take away to kind of immortalize their memories. And since most of them are not living at this point, it is through written text, documents, interviews, and records that I've read. But I kind of look at it through my perspective of, they carried the torch of these memories, and then now it's my job to take it on and then pass it on. So I can recondition those memories and ultimately give a space, an architectural space that people in today's world can go and experience their memories so they can kind of condition our response and our memories from that point. And then maybe in 100 years, someone does the same project of mine, and they'll look at my work and then they'll say the same answer where they'll take my memories from those people's memories and then continue it on their own way.
Are these memories somehow relatable? Or does the specific time and place have a specific sort of like essence that you can't necessarily understand without the specific records or being there?
Yeah, I would say it's extremely specific. I did a little project last year about memorial architecture, and I kind of coined the term the 4 S's to memorial architecture that make it successful. And it was the site, the scale of the project, the senses to the project, and then the soul behind the project. So the site, first of all, is extremely important. Oftentimes you'll find memorial architecture on hallowed battlegrounds or places like that that have particular significance to the thing they are memorializing. So I have chosen a site within the city of San Francisco in particular because it is very particular to that city. And kind of on a similar note, memory, as I've spoken about before, it's not something that is generic or general or all-encompassing. It's very, very specific. So even these people, they all have stories that are intertwined together. Throughout my process of trying to make the artifact, I went through a couple of renditions before the one you see before you today. But what I spoke with about my professor was how these people, they're not just existing in isolation. They all have this web that are kind of connecting them together. So that's kind of what I didn't realize right away at first. And then after a couple more renditions on the artifact, it was how I weave these stories all together to make it one cohesive story.
So the reality of disease is that there's an inner sickness that is being revealed outward, and it's quite harsh. And I was curious if your work addresses this, or does it look at sickness through politics of relationships and archetypes and things like that? Does it consider the real sickness of the individual, or does it look at the communal relationships that happen around that sickness?
I would say a little bit of both, but more so it focuses on the disease within the individual and the actual harm it causes to the biological human body. That's been a little theme in my work so far where I want to represent that kind of decay and slow loss of, biology through architecture, through patina. So I'm choosing to use concrete that's kind of left raw and exposed so it can kind of be weathered by the elements. But one thing I did speak of right away is memory. I read this quote one time and it was a good quote that kind of sums up my whole thesis. It says, without the fear of forgetting, we would ever need to use memory in the first place. And so I thought, while these people were passing away and their bodies were slowly decomposing, their memories would decompose with them. And so now my response to that is to preserve their memories and to preserve their body. So what I've done ultimately was I want to take that visceral feeling of the body and put it into my building. So the building, it's a real building. I mean, I hope it'll be a real building, but it's not theoretical. But when you go through it, there's nothing in it except for space. And the spaces are designed to influence and stir up like physical feelings about how you feel if you were in those same situations of the people that I am trying to memorialize. So I'd say it's more so visceral, and I am focusing on the decay of the body as along with memory.
You may have answered this a little bit in that question, but our culture often understands itself by what is there, what exists. So how do you think that we might represent or understand or connect or remember with absence in a meaningful way?
Yeah, I think so far I found in my research that it was contrary to what I expected going in, but oftentimes the absence of something can create more imagination than the presence of something. If something is sitting right in front of your face, you often don't need to imagine and wonder much about it because it's right there, versus if someone were to just use the specific few sentences in a narrative to paint a picture of something in your head, it's going to open up more of a imaginary realm, you could say. So I would argue that the imagination, yes, and the absence of people not there is important. And then now I am trying to create a concrete place for people to acknowledge that absence. But one thing I'm doing compared to other architects who have slightly taken this role before me is that they will make projects about memorial architecture, and some of them will focus on absence to represent like the nothingness and everything that has been lost before them. But I'm more so using emptiness and absence in my design to bring awareness to the presence of these memories. So I would say absence is an important thing, but my response to that is to create a particular place where we can focus on the presence of those absence, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, how do you think that scale or interactivity elevates people's understanding of your work?
Particular scale to the architecture itself.
Or discussing your artifact?
Well, a lot of the things in the artifact itself in particular they range in scale from large to small, whether they're the blocks or the objects in the blocks. But this is something I'm greatly focusing on in my architecture. I want to use large spaces to emphasize like the volume and magnitude of all the lives lost. But one thing in particular I'm doing is the architecture is just going to be this very neutral, almost confusing, regular box that sits in an abandoned lot in downtown San Francisco. And so people aren't going to be very aware of what it is from the outside, but it's just going to be this huge gray face. It's actually going to be elevated off the ground 1 story so people can walk under it. So you can kind of take all these memories and things and kind of capture them in this one box, walk below it, feel the magnitude of it. So I'm using large scale, big objects to kind of represent its, massive effect that it had, especially in the city of San Francisco. I think it's something they're still healing from. They have some existing memorials there, but I think this one will do it right.
So at the end of our interview, we like to ask a couple of questions about sort of your creative endeavors. So I was curious, what time of day do you feel like you are most creative?
Definitely 1 a.m. to 3:30 a.m. So I'm a night owl for sure.
And do you listen to music or the radio when you make work?
The last thing I went to study in college was film scoring. So if I listen to music, it's usually going to be like film or classical, but oftentimes I won't because it'll kind of sway my perspective to what I'm thinking of. So I oftentimes don't, but I don't like working in silence either. I like the people talking in the background and chatting a little bit. So the studio environment is a good place for me to work.
Are you reading anything right now?
Well, in studio last week, I got assigned to read another book. So I'm actually flying to San Francisco tomorrow to go visit my site and explore some of these characters. So I'm going to read the book on the plane. So it's called Borrowed Time, an AIDS memoir. It's about a man and his husband who were both diagnosed with AIDS. And then he was a poet and he writes about his experience watching his husband pass away in front of him and all their friends. And then on the last page, talks about how this is his last moment here on earth. And then at the end, you don't know, but you know that he passed away. So it's kind of a harrowing example of the pandemic.
You worked in a very specific medium. I was curious, what was the most difficult part about working in it?
Do you mean the medium of concrete and the artifact, or what do you mean by medium?
Yeah, the artifact.
That was a tough one because right away I used some wooden string, and then I used clothes and concrete little boxes. And then I had this idea in the back of my head this whole time, and I can't lie, I was hesitant to bring it up because I knew it would take hours and hours of painful, hard work to make this happen. But ultimately I decided concrete, I just personally like the aesthetic of it. So I 3D printed molds for each of the characters, and they're too big to 3D print in one bed. So I had to split it up into 4 or 5 chunks. Then each of those prints took 15 hours and there were about 60 prints. So that was a couple of days of printing. Then I had to glue them all together, put styrofoam in, pour the concrete in, let it cure, use a heat gun to peel off the plastic from the 3D printed, and my hands were all cut up and bruised afterwards, but I think it was worth it. Concrete, I think, is a very neutral object, and it might sound counterintuitive, but the more neutral and less specific you can make something, it kind of opens up other people's, I kind of encourage people to think about it themselves versus if I'm using something so specific and so unique, they're like, that's just what it is, versus concrete is more ambiguous in a way. So I like that material.
And then I guess my last question would be, what's next for you?
What's next? I actually have a job interview after this in 1 hour. So hopefully that is my next job, but architecture firm, I'd suppose right away. This sounds maybe silly being in my 5th year of architecture school. I'm not sure I'm set on architecture quite yet, but I really love design. I know I love design. I'll be in that area. And it's a good degree. It's a design degree. Architecture would make me happy. Architectural photography would make me really happy. Product design would make me happy, or graphic design would make me happy. So let's just say design is next.
Yeah. Well, good luck with the interview, and good luck with happiness, man. Love it. So I'd like to thank my guest, Beau, and I'd also like to thank you all at home for your time and your interest in the professional practice happening here at North Dakota State University. So thank you again, and for everyone here at the Memorial Union Gallery, keep creative.